Today we're going to talk about managing the 4 C's of compliance: corporate, culture, conduct, and communication. And we've got a great panel to share some insights on that today, and I'd like to start by introducing them. Emily Wall, our Vice President of Global Ethics and Compliance with Live Nation Entertainment, welcome. Carlos Pereira, the Head of Governance and Policy and Global Security for Meta. And then also Jerry Story, the Regulatory Compliance Principal for FedEx. And Jennifer Newton, the Chief Compliance and Ethics Officer for Catapay. And so we have some questions here that we're going to use with the panel to get started. And I'm going to read from my phone here. I promise you I'm not checking email. But I'd like to start off with you, Jennifer, if you could. The first question, and it's a 2-part question, don't you love those? What is your best advice to build resilient compliance today, and what role do the 4 C's play in that?
Sure, and I think that's a great question to kind of start this whole conversation off. So I think all of the 4 C's, they really serve as a foundational framework for developing an efficient compliance program. But when I think of resiliency in terms of the compliance program, I'm thinking of the ability to overcome challenges, the ability to adapt to changes. And then, so for me, to really build that kind of program, you really need to have a strong grasp of the industry, what industry you're operating in. And that means being a master of the regulatory framework, understanding what regulations apply to your organization, what regulations apply to your industry, what's happening within your industry, where regulators are focusing on, and really becoming that knowledge expert. And then the other thing in terms of building resiliency is being flexible, so being open to change. So I think a lot of folks work in their various positions for a long time, and we've seen it all. But I think to really survive in this climate and to build a sustainable program, you need to be open to being flexible and changing. And then the last thing I would say is also having a process improvement mindset. So not just focusing on checking the boxes, but looking for opportunities to improve your compliance program and looking for ways to always create more efficiency. And I think if you're always thinking ahead, that's going to enable you to be able to sustain and to adapt to changes as they affect your organization.
Great, thank you. And maybe we could expand that to the panel at large. How do you see the 4 C's intersecting and interplaying with each other, and is any one of them more important than the other?
I can take a crack. I have 4 kids, and when I was thinking about this particular question, I'm like, as a parent, you never say you have a favorite, but you know you have a favorite. And I gotta tell you, if your parents didn't tell you you're a favorite, just let you know you are not the favorite. Your siblings are the favorite. But for me, culture is probably one of the most elemental and foundational items associated with the 4 C's, because it's all predicated on how the organization is able to adapt and embrace the concepts of compliance and compliance adaptability and compliance regarding for any potential liability and litigation and the like. So I think it's important that you tailor the program around the culture of the organization. From company to company, it's very different from organization, small, big, or large, but it's important that the culture and the program that you're trying to deploy fits the organization. So, what do you think?
And I was going to add to that is that the one that touches all the others is communication. Whether it's the communication from corporate on down, that's one of the ways you build that culture. Whether it's communicating the culture amongst employees, and when you look at the 4 C's, it comes down in my mind to that communication piece. Even when you're being challenged, if they're challenging you in the field, at least they're engaged. It's when they get really quiet I get worried.
That's actually a really good point, because if folks aren't submitting like hotline issues, then that to me is an indication of an issue, right? So if we haven't adequately communicated how folks can get a hold of us, or what the compliance structure is, what the policies, procedure, and we haven't built that culture, as you said, of it's good to tell us if you see something, right? Then we've lost the game, right? So I think they all have to wrap together, but I would agree. I think culture is kind of the forefront, but you can't have that culture unless you've communicated it well.
And Carlos, maybe we could circle back with you on that. So how can we engage the front line to implement a positive compliance culture across the organization?
Yeah, I like sports, and one of the things that always it's amazing to me is that in many of our industries, from country to country, from state to state, the rules of the game, the regulations change. And in sports, imagine if you're doing soccer, basketball, and you knew that you and your team had to go play in different countries. And every country had different rules. It's important that you'd be able to not only, before you got there, understood what the laws, rules, and regulations are, and how you're going to prepare and train your team in order to be able to be in compliance with those things. It's the same thing around the implementation and compliance program, and being able to provide the education, the training, and awareness that the frontline team need in order to be in compliance. It's really difficult to expect them to be in compliance with the regulations if they don't even know what those regulations are. And so the identification and be able to communicate to the front line is paramount. Otherwise, you're not going to set them up for success. So
Makes sense.
Can I just build on your analogy there, the sports analogy? So yes, you have to know what your team is supposed to do in whatever location they're going to play in, but you're not going to fundamentally change the game either, right? So you're still going to hit the ball, or you're still going to whatever. So I think understanding what those similarities are across the regions in which you do business or that you function as an organization is key. And then layering in those idiosyncrasies, right? But understanding where they apply and where they don't, right? Because if you try to change your whole program based on this country or that region, you're going to fail because you won't have that consistency.
And I would add to all that, also I think having positive reinforcement mechanisms in an organization, it goes a long way with incentivizing and encouraging employees to buy into compliance and an ethical culture. I've worked at organizations where they've built in incentive-based programs that reward people for speaking up, reward people for reporting issues, solving problems. And so I think when you start to get their buy-in and start to create opportunities for them to be incentivized to comply and be incentivized to do the right thing, I think that brings about more of a compliance culture. And oftentimes though, you'll hear leaders say, I'm not going to pay people to do what they're required to do. Excuse me. But as you know, like ethics, it's not just about checking the boxes and doing what you're required to do the right thing. And that requires a little bit more of incentivizing employees. At least for me. I like lots of prizes.
Another question to the team at large then, how do you see compliance evolving over the next few years, and what do you see as the critical priorities for your individual organizations?
You know, when I look at my organization, so we're in 220 countries and territories around the world. So for the US FAA, there's an equivalent everywhere. If the US FAA hasn't changed the regulations today, I know somebody somewhere has. It's just a matter of mathematics. You know, and one of the things that I see more and more, though, in international trade and transportation is a harmonization among countries, partner countries, finding ways, even though the regulations aren't exactly the same, they find ways to harmonize them, or they find ways to have mutually recognized accreditations. And I think we're going to see more of that, because as compliance gets more and more difficult, as things like AI makes it easier to hide money laundering, because it will, right? Governments are going to need to spend more time on those issues rather than some of the other compliance issues they've looked at in the past. So they need us to be self-accredited, and therefore we need to be able to use those accreditations around the globe at least as much as possible.
Maybe I can complement the answer as well. I think the speed of regulatory change it's getting faster and faster. Up to now, a lot of the countries around the globe rely on mostly the US and Europe to dictate the rules of the game. What are the latest regulations? Now it's just about every single country will feel empowered to be able to customize what regulations are applicable for its country. For a multinational organization, that's really challenging. Up to now, you only have basically 2 or 3 regulators that you need to kind of please, but now you have everyone, and everyone will have fines and penalties, and sometimes even civil penalties, and including imprisonment and the like. So being able to identify that, I see in the near future the integration of RegTech. So there's a variety of different companies out there that can help you navigate this. It's nearly impossible for you to keep track of all the regulations all the time and find out which ones are important, which ones you're like, not much has changed there. So I think the integration of RegTech is something to focus on. So, Emily, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that, absolutely. So I think you're right in line, both of you, because if you're trying to, you're constantly chasing yourself, right? If you're just looking at what regulations are coming, how it would affect us and all that, you have to take a more holistic look, but also using technology, AI technology, to review, double check against your policies, your procedures, your operational resiliency, right? And throw out those gaps, but in a way that you can action them holistically, right? Because again, even having a list of your gaps does no good if you can't actually put in the action. So it has to be almost a more automated approach, right? Which is going to be that RegTech that you're talking about. And I think that's going to be the next big thing in regard to compliance. And not only that, but overlaps of different compliance, I guess, streams, right? So privacy, information security, ESG, AI, right? Is all of those overlap in some capacity. And if you're only looking at one silo and trying to solve for that, you're missing quite a bit.
And I'll just add to that, because of that overlap too, I think one of the things we're seeing is that it's now important for every industry to get familiar with regulatory requirements that are applicable to some of the data that they're harvesting. I think almost every industry harvests some sort of data, and so you are going to see data privacy laws and regulations hitting organizations that may not have been prepared for understanding how to comply with those kinds of rules and regulations. Cybersecurity, because data is currency and so valuable, we'll start to see maybe heightened regulation and enforcement around data security practices. So I think it's just going to be really focusing on what technology, the impact that it's having on consumers. And the wonderful thing to see, though, that I've seen as being a former regulator, regulators are struggling with keeping up to date and up to par and up to speed with where technology is going. And that's because of just the way that they are structured. So historically, the folks that came into regulatory agencies, they had industry knowledge that was there at the time that they joined the agency. And so now that technology and the industry is changing, they're struggling with keeping up to pace. And so it's a good time for the industry to stay ahead of that and to get familiar with how the regulations intersect with their industries and sort of start to drive that conversation and not wait for the regulators to do it, because they haven't done it before. It's new territory for them. Historically, regulators have focused on historical industries, and so I think you're going to see a lot of focus on trying to understand all of the evolving changes before establishing a new regulatory regimes. But I think it's incumbent on the industries to kind of get ahead of them and start the conversations and start the thought leadership, because there's a lot that regulators are struggling with. They really don't know this area. A lot of the tried and true regulators come from very antiquated technology platforms and old industry practices. And so they're really struggling with understanding where all of this technology is going. And so I think what's going to happen on the tail end is a lot of the robust data privacy and a lot of exploring what those impacts are on consumers.
Great, thank you, panel. But really the final question to kind of summarize everything is, what other thoughts or advice do you have for the audience to build a best-in-class modern compliance function that could keep up with these dynamic changes that are happening in the industry today?
I can take the crack. What I've seen organizations struggle sometimes is around documentation, because documentation is a control point. Every time you're going to have an examiner, an auditor, or the like, the first thing you're going to ask, give me the policies and procedures. And if you don't have that mastered right off the bat, it's not going to build the credibility that you and your programs would have. And right off the bat, you're going to piss off some regulators, some auditor, or something like that. And it just doesn't show like you have your stuff together.
Yeah.
So documentation is absolutely essential. And it also, the documentation, the benefit is actually provides the rest of the organization with the rules of the game and how your organization will embrace a concept, a regulation, a requirement, a process, a product, a service, or the like. It just shows that you are very organized and methodical around how do you deploy your services and your products instead of, how's the wind blows. So I would focus on documentation as a core competency of a good compliance program. If you don't have the documentation buttoned up, everyone is doing whatever they want, and it's a zoo. So, Jerry, what do you think?
When I think about this question, I think about the people in this room right now. We are sharing information among each other. And all too often in our own industries, we don't share information with our competitors. Because let's face it, we don't like them. I got one laugh, that's good. But the fact of the matter is, I belong to the Express Association of America. Right? We sit down and we discuss the issues that are impacting our organization as an entire business. And we try to come up with ways to be better. And I think that going forward, for compliance purposes and other purposes, we're going to have to do more of that sharing of what's been working, what hasn't been working. We're not going to give somebody else the secret sauce, right? But we're at least going to tell them that there is a sauce that goes on the burger. If you understand what I'm saying there. It just makes sense to me. And for all too often, we've siloed ourselves from others in our industries. And I think with how fast regulations are changing, technology is changing, I think we need to be willing to share that basic information amongst each other and learn from each other.
So can I piggyback on what you just said? Because I was actually going to talk about silos as well, which you talked about within industry and across industries. And I was going to bring it up really within your own corporation and your partners and your sponsors and your shareholders. Because trying to solve for something just in your little bubble without getting feedback from the operational side of your team or from other corporate structures that are also trying to solve for stuff and maybe vying for the ear of the operational side or the ear of the board or whatever. You all have a role to play within the company. And if you're not cross-sharing and saying, hey, I'm looking at this tool, but it also could be beneficial for this and this and this, why don't we all use it and share information? And then you have those partners within the business, and you start to build that culture and that communication hub, right? And it all kind of builds together. So it's not just corporate coming and saying, let's do this because we have to, right? It's an add value to the business, maybe because everything's in a database, they can do enterprise deals better with third parties or whatever, right? So look for those add values and bridge the gap for those conversations across various silos within your business.
I just agree with everyone said. I think sharing information, acquiring as much information as you can about the industry, what's happening internally at your organization, and understanding what those industry risks are specifically to your organization, and just being on the cutting edge of where the regulatory climate is going, I think is going to help you build out that program, because it's very difficult to try to do that in a silo. You really don't want to operate as an outlier. You want to understand what the industry is doing so you can better correspond with regulators. And the more you are that knowledge expert, the more I think you can become more persuasive in your conversations with regulators and in your support for changes that you want to instill in business. You really have to have that understanding of what practices should be expected of your organization, what the industry is doing, where it's going, what are some of the pain points, what are other organizations doing to really be able to develop a good, solid program that you're comfortable with and that allows your leaders to sleep well.
Yeah. Well, panel, thank you very much. Audience, any questions for the panel or comments that you'd like to make? Share? Yes, sir.
For the multinational companies, corporations, so especially in smaller countries, how do you manage to get information about the changes in compliance, because instead there will be multiple changes happening, and by the time you come to know, already few defaults already happened. Some of them could be criminal, could be civil.
Go ahead. You go first.
Okay. Many organizations rely on some reg text. Can
you
we
might
mention?
say what the question was?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Yes. The question is, how does a multinational company are able to keep up with the change, particularly for small countries and or principals and the like, where the change is happening that may or may not make the news, basically. And how does a big organization address that? It has to be technology. There's a lot of machine learning and AI, but mostly machine learning right now, where, can I mention a couple names of companies that MetricStream might partner with? It's not being endorsed with. Foresee Risk, Regology, and those are two of the major players in this space that they have mastered this. They really have built some amazing tooling that actually works, and it is actually to be able to give you the information that you need. So at any given point, you want to find out what is the KYC equivalent of Madagascar, I don't know, pick a country, that the system has the built-in technology to go into the regulatory body to translate the lane into English, the regulations, and then be able to provide you feeds and alerts around what are the regulations associated with that. So those are two of the companies that I'm very familiar with that I think it's worthwhile taking a look. So, but it's really challenging. The smaller the country is, the worse it is. Do you want to complement that? Otherwise, if I don't know.
So we can go to the
Oh.
I was just going to say, for each of you in your roles, what are your measuring sticks so that you know that you are successful with, you develop a compliance mindset, your conduct risk is under control, and you can communicate effectively? That's it.
Yeah, so that's like the star, right, that everybody's trying to hit. The DOJ came out with compliance guidance, and it says you have to have an effective compliance program. They didn't specify what effective meant, right? So it's up to the company to kind of figure that out. So my thought, or my opinion, is that you have to have a layered approach. It's not one thing, right? You have to have great policies and procedures. You have to have very thorough documentation. But you also have to know that those change over time because the regulatory landscape changes. Your business may change. You may acquire new partners or new business avenues in new countries, right? So you have to have multiple layers. You have to have really, really good training. Back to your point, the communication. If folks don't know that there's a law or regulation they're supposed to follow, then they're probably not going to comply with it, right? So it's just a bunch of layers is the way I would approach that. Anybody want to add?
Yeah, and I think within those layers, it's been effective for our organization to have established metrics. So we're a startup organization, so we're actually right at the beginning stages of developing a strong and robust compliance program. But as part of that, we're focused on developing metrics that will provide that information and allow us to report on how efficient our policies and procedures are. How are we doing with regard to monitoring? And so you really should probably establish those things at the forefront as you're building the program so that you can monitor how effective those components are working.
And the thing I'll add there from our organization, in addition to what you're talking about as far as stratified layers of controls, as far as making those connections, making sure people understand what they're supposed to do. We also, as an organization, we have regular meetings with the VPs and the MDs around the globe, and our question to them is not how well are you doing, it's how well are we doing, right? So we're monitoring them. We see if there's a fine or a penalty. We're monitoring to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do about reviewing reports and things of that nature. But to me, to close that loop off is how are we doing? How are we helping you? How are we hindering you? And we take that to heart and try to find a way to make it better so that they don't dislike coming to us. Instead, they'd rather come to us and hope we can provide a solution.
I was just to end with, if your name is not in the front page at Wall Street Journal, you're doing okay.
And we'll close on that note. We're up on time, but I'd like to thank our panel very much for sharing sharing their insights today, and thank you